Once the renal corpuscle has finished the process of filtration, the filtrate will now enter into the renal tubule. So we'll take a look at the renal tubule in this video. So the renal tubule is a tube, right? So it has a wall, and the wall of this tube is composed mostly of simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. So it's one cell layer thick, which makes it easy to get things across, and they're cubed in shape. And it's important that we can get things across this tube because that's what we're going to do, is we're going to move substances into the tube and out of the tube in order to fine-tune urine formation. Different parts of the renal tubule have different names. The filtrate leaves the renal corpuscle and enters into the first part of the renal tubule called the proximal convoluted tubule. It's called proximal because it's the first part of the tube that's closest to that corpuscle. The term convoluted is referring to the fact that it's all twisty and turny. When the fluid moves from the corpuscle into the renal tubule, it changes names. We now call it tubular fluid, but it's the same thing as filtrate. And technically you could still call it filtrate too, that's fine. From the proximal convoluted tubule, the tubular fluid will then flow into the nephron loop. The nephron loop has two parts to it, the descending limb and then the ascending limb. So the tubular fluid will go down the descending limb and up the ascending limb. From there, the tubular fluid will go into the distal convoluted tubule, and then it will enter into the collecting duct. The collecting duct is the last part of the renal tubule, and that empties into a minor calyx within the kidney. And don't forget, the whole outside of the nephron is covered with a capillary. And this capillary is called the peritubular capillary, except for the portion of the capillary that's covering the nephron loop. That's called the vasa recta, but I won't be asking you about that. So now that we know a little bit about the structure of the renal tubule, what about its function? As I mentioned before, basically the renal tubule is adjusting the composition of the fluid inside of the tube. And the renal tubule can do this by adding stuff to the tubular fluid or taking stuff away from the tubular fluid. When we add extra stuff to the tubular fluid, we call this secretion. We're secreting the substance into the tubular fluid. Not to be confused with excretion. Excretion is going to be what happens when the urine actually leaves the body. When we take stuff away from the tubular fluid and bring it back into the body, we call that process reabsorption. And this exchange is going to be occurring between the tubular fluid and the blood of the capillaries that are coating the outside of the nephron. Whatever's left at the end of the tube, at the end of the collecting duct, will become urine, and it's not going to be further adjusted. So it's a common misconception that students have that urine composition is adjusted in the urinary bladder, but it's not. The bladder is only for storage. There's a really interesting structure that's actually part of the corpuscle and part of the tubule, and that's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Juxta means next to, so part of this structure is next to the glomerulus. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is made of a couple different groups of cells. One group is called the macula densa, and these are cells that are actually making up the wall of the part of the distal convoluted tubule that's right next to the afferent and efferent arterioles. So I mentioned that the distal convoluted tubule is very convoluted, right? So some of these twists and turns bring the distal convoluted tubule right up against the glomerulus. And the cells in the wall of the distal convoluted tubule they're taller than the normal cuboidal cells, and they're going to have a different function than the typical cuboidal cells. These macula densa cells are going to be really important for regulating the process of filtration and urine formation in that particular nephron. The other group of cells that make up the juxtaglomerular apparatus are the juxtaglomerular cells. And these are actually a type of smooth muscle cell. Most of these smooth muscle cells are surrounding the afferent arteriole. So as you can imagine, if these smooth muscle cells, if these juxtaglomerular cells, or JG cells as we abbreviate it, if these cells contract, they're going to squeeze that afferent arteriole so that the diameter of the lumen of that arteriole gets really small. Maybe even closes it, right? But if the diameter gets really small, less fluid is going to enter the glomerulus, and that's going to be a really important way to regulate what's happening in that glomerulus.